This is Whisper from History, where forgotten voices rise again. Imagine a power that defeats its enemy, not with the sword, but with poison. This is the story of a war fought not with blades, but with poison. Stay with us until the very end. In the late 18th century, two great civilizations faced each other across the seas. On one side stood Britain, a rising imperial power whose navy commanded the oceans, and whose merchants craved wealth beyond measure. On the other stood China, the Middle Kingdom, vast and ancient, proud of its traditions and convinced of its own self-sufficiency. Their destinies would collide not through diplomacy or cultural exchange, but through a bitter trade in a dangerous substance, opium. What unfolded was a saga of greed, addiction, humiliation, and revenge that changed the course of world history. For centuries, China had been the center of luxury goods desired by Europeans. Tea, porcelain, and silk poured into Britain, filling drawing rooms and dinner tables. But there was a problem. China demanded payment in silver, refusing European manufactured goods. The balance of trade bled Britain's silver reserves dry. British merchants grew desperate for a commodity that the Chinese would buy in large quantities. They found their answer in the poppy fields of British-controlled India. Opium had been known in China for medicinal use since the Tang dynasty, but the British East India Company transformed it into a commercial weapon. They cultivated vast plantations of poppies in Bengal, processed the sticky resin into chests of opium, and shipped it across the seas. By the late 1700s, smuggling networks funneled the drug into southern China, where it spread like wildfire. At first, the Qing court dismissed the problem as marginal, but addiction crept into every corner of society. From peasants to scholars, even soldiers, the empire's veins pulsed with the poison. By the early 19th century, the scale was staggering. Tens of thousands of chests entered China annually, each containing over 100 pounds of opium. Millions of Chinese became dependent, their health ruined, their productivity lost. Silver now flowed out of China, reversing the trade balance that Britain had once resented. Families pawned heirlooms to feed their cravings. Imperial officials watched with alarm as the treasury drained, threatening the economic stability of the dynasty. The Qing emperor could no longer ignore the catastrophe. In 1839, he dispatched one of his most incorruptible officials, Commissioner Lin Zexu, to the southern port of Canton, the heart of the opium trade. Lin was a man of iron will, determined to save his nation from collapse. He issued a proclamation. The importation of opium would end. Foreign merchants must surrender their stock, and anyone caught trafficking would face harsh punishment. Lin's crackdown was relentless. He seized and destroyed over 20,000 chests of opium, mixing the black resin with lime and salt before dumping it into the sea at Humen. To the Chinese, it was an act of righteous defense, a moral stand against the poison undermining their people. To the British, it was an insult and a provocation. Merchants in London demanded retribution. They claimed their property had been destroyed without compensation, and their national pride bruised. In Parliament, debates raged not about the morality of drug trafficking, but about defending British honor and protecting commercial interests. The decision was made. Gunboats would sail east to teach China a lesson. Thus began the First Opium War, a conflict where industrial might faced an ancient empire unprepared for modern warfare. In 1839 and 1840, British steamships armed with cannons appeared off China's coast. They moved with deadly precision, their iron shells smashing through wooden junks. Chinese forces, relying on outdated weapons and tactics, were no match. Fortresses crumbled, and coastal cities burned. The British Navy controlled the seas, cutting supply lines and forcing open ports. The war was not a battle between equals, it was a slaughter. By 1842, the Qing court, battered and humiliated, sought peace. The Treaty of Nanjing was signed, the first of what the Chinese would call the unequal treaties. Its terms were devastating. China was forced to cede Hong Kong to Britain, open 5 ports to foreign trade, grant extraterritorial rights to British citizens, and pay a massive indemnity in silver. Strikingly, the treaty said nothing about opium itself. The poison trade continued unabated, sanctioned by British power, but humiliation bred resentment. China's sovereignty had been violated, its pride wounded. Ordinary Chinese saw their empire reduced to submission, while foreign merchants grew rich from their suffering. Yet the worst was still to come. Opium imports surged after the treaty. Addiction deepened. Millions more Chinese succumbed to the drug, their lives consumed by smoke and dreams. Families disintegrated, communities hollowed out. Imperial officials, weakened and divided, struggled to respond. Corruption spread, with many bureaucrats themselves addicted. The dynasty's moral authority eroded. Meanwhile, Britain reaped immense profits. The East India Company monopolized the opium trade, funneling revenue back into its empire. The British treasury gained silver, while the Indian economy was chained to the production of narcotics. The triangular trade, Indian farmers producing, British merchants shipping, Chinese addicts consuming, became one of the most lucrative operations in imperial history. By the 1850s, China's frustration boiled over again. In 1856, another confrontation sparked the Second Opium War. This time, Britain was joined by France. Their demands were not only commercial, but political: greater access to markets, legalization of opium, and the right to establish embassies in Beijing. Once again, Western firepower overwhelmed Chinese defenses. Foreign troops marched into the capital, looted the summer palace, and left behind ashes where centuries of art and culture had stood. The treaties that followed were even harsher. The Treaty of Tientsin and the Convention of Peking legalized the opium trade, opened more ports, allowed foreign missionaries deeper access into the countryside, and granted yet larger indemnities. The drug that had first seeped into China through smuggling was now legitimized under international law. Backed by the canons of empire, the human toll was catastrophic. By the late 19th century, it is estimated that over 10% of China's population was addicted to opium. Millions of lives wasted in smoke-filled dens, bodies broken, families impoverished, the social fabric unraveled. China's military weakened, its economy drained, its government crippled. Historians would later call it a century of humiliation, a time when foreign powers carved spheres of influence and dictated terms to a proud civilization brought low. For Britain, it was a story of triumph at the time, a demonstration of naval supremacy and commercial dominance. But it was also a story of moral blindness. Debates in London occasionally questioned the ethics of poisoning a nation for profit, but the lure of silver and tea silenced most dissent. To many in Britain, it was justified revenge for the arrogance of Chinese officials who had dared to resist imperial trade. To China, it was an unforgettable wound. The legacy of the Opium Wars endured far beyond the 19th century. They reshaped China's relationship with the outside world, embedding deep suspicion toward Western powers. They fueled nationalist movements that eventually sought to overthrow the Qing dynasty and later resist foreign domination. Even today, the memory of the opium trade is invoked as a symbol of exploitation, a reminder of how addiction was weaponized as a tool of empire. What makes this chapter of history so haunting is the deliberate nature of it. The British government knew the devastation opium caused. Officials received reports of widespread addiction and social collapse. Yet they pressed forward, because the profits were too great and the humiliation of being excluded from Chinese markets too bitter. It was not an accident of history, but a calculated revenge through commerce, enforced at gunpoint. The story of Britain's opium revenge on China is not just about 2 wars or a series of treaties. It is about how human greed can hollow out entire societies, how power can twist morality, and how the scars of imperialism can last for generations. It is about the ordinary Chinese who lost their health, their families, and their futures to a foreign poison. It is about Indian peasants forced to cultivate poppies instead of food, trapped in a system that profited distant rulers. And it is about a British Empire that proclaimed civilization while spreading destruction. The echo of those years still resonates. In China, the phrase national humiliation often begins with the memory of opium. In Britain, the story remains a shadow, less spoken but impossible to erase. It is a reminder that empires are not only built on conquest and technology, but on choices that can devastate millions. Across the centuries, the Opium Wars stand as a dark testament to the cost of revenge, disguised as trade. A powerful empire, affronted by the refusal of another to bow to its demands, chose to weaponize addiction. The result was a chapter of history that reshaped nations, destroyed lives, and left behind wounds that time has not fully healed. This story is not just about war. It is about human greed, where wealth silences conscience. And it was this hunger for wealth that condemned a nation to generations of humiliation. If you found this story powerful, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and explore our Dark Playlist series. This video is narrated by an AI voice. Script and editing done by human.